Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to take a look at the Anbernic RG DS. This just arrived yesterday, and I've been messing with it ever since, and I've got a few thoughts. Now, we've known about this handheld for a long time. Anbernic has been talking about it for a couple months at this point. And they're trying to position this thing as being a modern version of the Nintendo DS. In fact, it even looks like a regular DS and has almost the exact same dimensions as the DSi XL. They're also promoting it as being relatively affordable. It's about $100 before shipping, and that is quite a bit cheaper than some of the other clamshell options we've seen so far this year, like the AYN Thor. However, in just these first 24 hours, I've run into so many problems with the RGDS that I feel like it's not in a reviewable state. And so my plan for this video is to go over all the good and bad with this handheld, and yeah, it's a bit of a hot mess. So grab your favorite spicy snack and drink, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's start with the specs, and this is running the RK3568 as its CPU. And this is a pretty low-powered chip. It's about the same as the RK3566 that we saw in a lot of their flagship handhelds a few years back. The RAM and storage is pretty anemic. We've got 3 gigs of RAM and 32 gigs of internal storage, which is going to be really limiting if you plan on playing Android games on this because you don't have that much space. Thankfully, there is a microSD card slot, so you can put your ROMs on a card and then expand your storage that way. Now, this is a dual screen device, so it's got two 4-inch displays with a 480p resolution, 4:3 aspect ratio, and they are LCDs. And they've used a very similar screen in other devices like the RG40XXV, so no surprises there either. It is worth noting that when compared to the Nintendo DS original resolution, this is a 2.5x resolution scale, which means that if you are going to blow it up to fill up the entire screen, you will have unbalanced pixels. Your other alternative would be to do a 2x resolution upscale, but that's going to give you some pretty significant borders around the screen and only give you about 3.2 inches of actual game space. It's got a 4000 mAh battery, which is a pretty decent size, and they say it's going to give you 6 hours of battery life, but in my testing, at least so far, I've only seen about 4 hours on average. And of note, because this is an Android platform, you can use just about any USB-C cable or charger, it's going to work. But also bear in mind, it's not a fast charging machine. The fastest I've seen it go is about 7 watts, which takes about 3 hours to fully charge. In terms of weight, it's a pretty nice balance, 312 grams or about 11 ounces altogether. No complaints there. For connectivity, we have 2.4 and 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi, as well as Bluetooth 4.2 and a 3.5mm headphone jack. It's also worth noting this device does not have video out, so no HDMI port like other devices, and it also does not provide video out via USB-C. It's running Android 14, and the other notable feature is that it has a Hall magnetic sensor that allows you to close the lid and put it to sleep. Now, the RGDS has been up for pre-order for about 3 or 4 weeks, and the MSRP is $100, but right now they have a $6 off coupon, so you can get it for $94 on their website. But bear in mind that that does not include shipping, and I've tested it here, and it looks like they're charging about $25 for shipping, so you're looking at about $120 to get this to your door. Now, if you want a better deal, it looks like their AliExpress listing is a little bit better off. It's still going to be $94, but the shipping is cheaper. It's only $16 here, and you'll be able to stack on coupons if you want as well, if there are any available. They're offering 3 different color options: turquoise blue, polar white, and black and crimson red. And I've got 2 of them here for testing, the blue and the red ones, and I think just by looking at the outside, I really like the black and red model. I like the contrast of the 2 colors, and it reminds me of that old black and red DS Lite that came out back in the day. However, when you get them opened up, I actually prefer the turquoise one, just because it's a little bit more colorful and poppy compared to just the drab black that you have on the one on the right. And so I think between the 2, I'm going to stick with the turquoise blue one as my main version of this handheld for testing and everything else, just because I like the way it looks when you open it up. It is worth noting that much like the DS Lite, the top cover of these devices is very shiny and reflective, and also pretty fingerprinty too. Okay, let's take a look inside the box. Now, these 2 review units were sent over from Anbernic for review, but like with all my videos, they're not going to see this ahead of time. All opinions are my own, and no money was exchanged in any way. The box is really bare bones. It just has the names of the colors, and really that's about it. So inside, we've got the device, and underneath that, it comes with its own stylus. We'll check this out in a moment. And in the bottom of the box, we've got 2 screen protectors for obvious reasons, a quick start manual, and then a lanyard. It also comes with a USB-A to C charging cable, but you could use basically any cable. It's going to work on this device. Now, taking a look at the handheld, first impression was that, yeah, it really does remind me of like a DSi XL because it's very similar in overall size. And we knew this kind of going into it because the dimensions are almost identical between this and the original hardware. It's also quite a bit bigger than something like the DS Lite, both in terms of just overall width and height as well. Now, beyond the size, the next thing that really stood out to me about this is that it actually feels quite a bit cheaper than the original hardware. And part of that has to do with just the overall machining and design here. So you can see it's a pretty sharp corner right here. They've got a bit of an angle at one side, but otherwise it's kind of a 90-degree drop off. All the Nintendo consoles have a bit more of a roundedness to them, which I think just feels a little bit more elegant in the hands. By contrast, this one's just a little bit sharper and just doesn't feel as good. I think the overall quality is pretty good. Like, it's got a nice matte plastic here and then that shiny texture on the other side. But yeah, it's kind of the angular part of it that just feels a little bit sharp and unwelcoming to me compared to just that nice rounded feeling of an actual DS console. The material quality of the DSi XL also feels better to me. Like, it's got this bit of like bumpy texture to it that isn't really there on the Anbernic. This one feels a bit more slick and kind of cheaper by contrast. And so I like that this has a bit of a grippiness to it. And unfortunately, the Anbernic lacks that. And so overall, yes, the Anbernic looks a lot like a DS, but it doesn't have the same roundedness and fun to it. Another thing that lends to its sort of cheaper feeling are these shoulders and triggers, which are really clicky and loud, which is unfortunate. They feel very cheap. The DSi only has shoulder buttons, but they're more subtle and also quieter too. They have a bit of a dampening to them, and it feels like Anbernic did not go that route. And so this is what kind of prompted that first impression of it feeling a bit cheaper and just not as nice as the original. Now, I think that if you don't have a DSi XL on you and you hold this thing, you're going to be like, oh yeah, this is just like how it was. But when you actually have one to compare with, they're kind of night and day. Let me give you a quick sound test of these shoulders and triggers so you can hear what it sounds like. Now, I think one of the things they nailed about the RG DS is that it has the same sort of thickness as something like a DSi XL and a DSi Lite. And so I love the fact that they kept it very slim. It's a rather large clamshell when you think about it, much like how the DSi XL was originally, but I still think it's very pocketable. And part of that might be the fact that, we're all used to putting pretty big phones in our pockets, and this kind of feels a lot like that. It's a little bit wider and thicker, but I can definitely feel this as being an excellent pocketable little handheld. It helps that there aren't controls sticking out like analog sticks, which will get caught in your pocket. And so yes, this is an easy one to slip in and out. It certainly doesn't have the same feeling as a DSi Lite, which I think is just a really magically pocketable little handheld, but I think that's a whole different category altogether. That being said, the thinness does come at a price, and I have found this device getting quite hot even when just playing regular old DS games. Now, the front of the handheld is fine. You've got a couple hot spots that'll get up to about 37 degrees Celsius, but that's very similar to skin temperature, and so as a result, it just doesn't feel very warm to me. However, on the back, if you try to play anything more intensive than like Super Nintendo games, I've definitely been feeling it heating up, about 40 to 41 degrees Celsius. I definitely wouldn't classify this as hot. I wouldn't even really call it uncomfortable, but it is worth noting that it does get a little bit warm on the back. Let's take a look around. So we've got the micro SD card slot and OTG port. So this will be for like external controllers. And then finally our DC USB port. This is going to be for charging. On the right side, we've got our volume up and down, our power sleep button, and then also there's going to be a charging indicator right here when you plug it in. Not a lot going on the bottom. We've got a 3.5mm headphone jack and then nothing on the left, but it is worth noting we've got two different lanyard holes on each side. The back just has the Anbernic logo and then a couple little dots right here, as you can see, to prevent it from getting scratched directly on a surface. One notable absence is they don't have a stylus holder here, which I think would have really set this over the edge as being a Nintendo DS replacement. I appreciate that they included a stylus like this one, but there's no way to slot it in anywhere, and I feel like this is going to get easily lost. The stylus itself feels very cheap. It's kind of like those ones that you can get on Amazon for like $10 for $10. It's got a rubber nub on the top of it, and then also you can pull off the cap, and it's got a disc stylus here as well. I found that this tip does give a more precise input, but it also doesn't feel very authentic. Honestly, neither of these do, just because we're working with a capacitive touchscreen as opposed to a resistive one on the original DS devices. I made a whole video talking about styluses and how all this stuff works and my personal favorites, and so I will leave that link down below if you want to learn more about it. I've mentioned this stylus in other videos before, but I've been using this one. This is an aluminum stylus that also has a disc tip to it, but it's also a lot more responsive. And so this is the one that I've been using personally. It's on Etsy. I'll leave it linked down below. What I like about this one is that it's small enough to actually feel like a Nintendo DS stylus, which is a really important thing if you're going for that nostalgia factor. For being a free stylus, this one definitely gets the job done, but it feels more like holding a pen than an actual DS stylus. Let's talk about the hinge for a second. So this is very different than what you may expect from a Nintendo console. This one is a lot more resistant. Like, you can just basically push it up, but it's pretty tight and it'll stick in any direction. It doesn't click at all. With the regular DS, you're probably used to just kind of opening it up quickly and it'll click into place and you can kind of close it very nicely. And so it's just kind of a fun and satisfying way to use a clamshell. This one kind of feels like the opposite, where you have to open it up kind of slowly like a laptop, and then you find your position and then you can close it again. And it just doesn't have that same kind of satisfying smack to it. Instead, you just kind of have to be a little bit more deliberate with it. This is a 2-hinge mechanism, so there's 2 different parts to it, but I do have some concern because it's so tight. I feel like maybe there's too much tension and torque and that may crack this plastic at some point. So that's one of those things we'll have to see over time. But yeah, I have one concern about that. I wish it was a little bit looser. Now that we have it open, let's take a look at the design. And I think it's a weird mix of being kind of nice looking, but then also somewhat cheap. If we look at the top half, you can see that the speakers are kind of jutting out of the plastic. I love the fact that they are actually top firing speakers. I think this is really excellent. But I also don't like the fact that I can see the speakers sort of protruding out of the plastic. It just makes it look a little cheap. Same thing with these 4 different screw hole covers. At first I thought they were nice little pads that prevent you from, damaging your device, but no, they're just there to cover up the screw holes in case you need to get in the device. It does have a couple actual pads on each side, but they are really thin, and so I'm not really sure they're doing anything. On the bottom half, I'm also similarly conflicted. I like that we have the D-pad and face buttons up top like this. It just feels very comfortable because it's so high up. But then we also have these 2 analog sticks, which are kind of in a worse position in terms of ergonomics, but I appreciate that they have them in the first place. You're probably not going to use these sticks that often for Nintendo DS games, maybe for some 3D style games with the analog stick, but for the most part, I would say this is mostly going to be used for emulating other systems. And I also think that the presence of 2 analog sticks led a lot of people to think that this might be a 3DS friendly handheld, which I don't think it is. We'll talk about that more later. Further down, we've got our 4 function buttons, select and start on the right side, and then an Anbernic button, which will bring up their launcher, and then a home and back button for Android. And that's about it. Let's talk about the controls. We'll start with the D-pad. So this is a dome switch D-pad, which means it has very light travel to it, and it kind of clicks down with a soft click, very similar to other clamshells that have been made by Anbernic. The actuation force on this is pretty light. You only have to press it down a little bit to actually get the button to press down, so I think it feels pretty good overall. This type of D-pad will not have pivot to it. It just kind of clicks into place, but it doesn't roll around like a rubber membrane D-pad, so it doesn't have a very classic or retro feel to it. When testing a game like Contra, if I press down on the D-pad and lightly rock it left and right, the character will stay in place, and that's because I'm not pushing it far enough to actually click. However, if I give it more pressure, I can definitely make the character move, and I will get a click at the same time. The travel on this D-pad is so thin that it doesn't feel very satisfying to rock it left and right. For example, when a game like Mario Kart DS, where you have to rock it left and right to activate that slide skill, it doesn't feel very natural on this one compared to on an actual DS. So I wouldn't go as far as to call this D-pad mushy, but it kind of feels like that, where it's a little bit unresponsive. I observed the same thing when trying out a Street Fighter style fighting game where I'm trying to hit a diagonal, and this is also a little bit mushy feeling, even though it is a clicky D-pad. With enough practice and force, yes, I can pull off these special moves, not every single time, but fairly often. But it does feel to me like the D-pad should have been raised up, maybe just a little bit, like a millimeter, just to give it a little bit of that more rocking feeling, and I think that would have been a better solution. So all in all, I think it's an okay D-pad. I think the cardinal points are very clicky and easy to use, but when it comes to actually doing the diagonals or rocking it left and right, it doesn't feel as natural as the original console. On the other hand, these face buttons are great. They are also dome switches with a very light travel to them, but because we're not like rocking them left to right or anything, they feel great. Like, it's just very precise, easy to press down on. So I love these face buttons, but the D-pad not so much. Now, I'm not a fan of these analog sticks either. They are essentially PS Vita style sticks where they have that same kind of design to them. They've got a little bit of rubber at the top of them, but it's very slick and it feels kind of cheap. And so, yeah, this just doesn't feel very good. The range of motion here is very limited. It just kind of flops over in place, much like it did on the PS Vita. And the sides of the sticks are also a little bit sharp too. It doesn't feel very good. And so I found that the combination of that somewhat slick cap just doesn't feel good. Like I'm moving my thumb around and my thumb is just kind of sliding all over. And then it's getting caught on the sides of the analog stick, which just don't feel very good. In addition to not feeling very good on their own, I feel like the inputs are somewhat flawed too. There's a lot of cardinal snapping here where it wants to stay at the north, south, east, and west directions, and it does inhibit that whole analog feeling. It's kind of hard to get to any of the quadrants. You can go along the edges, no problem. You can go along the cardinal directions as well, but everything outside of that doesn't feel very good. So overall, I'm not a huge fan of these sticks, but one other thing worth noting is they do click down for L3 and R3. Now these function buttons are fine, they're little micro switches, but they do feel somewhat dampened, and so they're not super loud, but they're easy to press down on, and they're kind of flush with the rest of the case, so I don't feel like you're going to press on them accidentally either. As far as the shoulders and triggers, they're loud, like I mentioned, but they are easy to press down on, which I like, and the triggers are a little bit taller than the shoulders too, so as you rest your fingers here, you can kind of hit both of them at any time, and because they're of a different height, it is pretty easy. Now, because the device is so slim, there's not a lot of space for your index finger up here. So if you've got really fat fingers, this might be a little bit harder to hold on to, but for me, it's been okay. So overall, I would say the controls are decent. I think it's a very D-pad centric handheld, and that's the most comfortable position here. I do appreciate that we have analog sticks if we want them, but I don't see myself using them very often. Now, as far as ergonomics, it is a pretty comfortable handheld. You've got a lot of space for your fingers on the back, and so it feels like I can kind of spread out really easily. So I got no problem actually holding the device. The only negative I have here is just that sharp angle like I mentioned before. It just doesn't feel as comfortable as I'm holding it compared to an actual DS product. So all things considered, it's a comfortable handheld. I like the way it feels in the hand, and I think it's better than something like the RG35XX SP, which is more GBA SP style, because this one's a bit more cramped. And so I like the fact that we have a lot of space for this one. I would say this is pretty comfortable. Okay, now let's talk about these displays. So we've got relatively small bezels around the side, so I think it actually looks pretty good, and I like that they kind of flow into the rest of the shell. And these are 4 inches, which I think is a pretty impressive size altogether. Now the screen sizes on the DSi XL are actually a little bit larger. These are 4.2 inches compared to 4 here, but I do think that these panels are a little bit nicer looking, they're more updated, and they do have a little bit more richness in their overall vibrance. And so while I do really like the screens on the DSi XL, especially because they're actually integer scaled, I think that the overall colors and pop of the RGDS are also pretty good. The screens don't get as bright as I would like. This is 100% brightness, and you can see here that it's actually about what I would play it at. In general, I play it at about 80% brightness, so this is a relatively dim screen. For example, you can play this thing outdoors in daylight, but you have to do it under shade. If you try to play it in direct sunlight, it's going to be impossible to see. So these are not the brightest screens in the world. On the other hand, it does get very dim. Even in a really dark environment, it's still nice and dim. So if you wanted to play this, say for example, in bed at night, this will be pretty good. In terms of audio, I would say these speakers are not the best, but I love the fact that they are on the top screen. We haven't really seen that with a lot of clamshell handhelds, and I think it really improves the audio because it makes the speakers closer to your ears. And I think the audio quality at this price point is decent. Like, I don't really have any major complaints about it. It sounds pretty good, and I love the fact that they're on the top screen. However, one thing I did notice is the speakers give off a buzzing sound. Even if you have it at completely mute, you can still hear it. And if you're playing in a quiet room, you will definitely hear that buzzing. Let me try to pick it up here with the mic. So my guess is they're using either really cheap speakers or just really bad wiring, but yes, there's a buzzing here that's kind of annoying. So overall, when it comes to the hardware design, I don't have a ton of complaints. I think that it looks a little bit cheap and it feels a little bit cheap, but overall it's okay. I've got some nitpicks about the D-pad and the analog sticks, but I think in general, there's no real big deal breakers for me. However, now we're gonna look at the software, and this is where things get really rough. Now, Anbernic has never been great when it comes to making their Android builds, but this one is probably the worst that I've seen in a long time. Let's take a look at the black one because I haven't changed the software on this one. It comes preloaded with a bunch of emulator apps, and unfortunately many of these, if not most of them, are paid apps. And it's always really disappointing to me that Anbernic doesn't respect the developers who are creating these paid apps. Instead, they just steal it and put it on their devices. One thing worth noting, the RGDS does not come with Google Play Store, so this is not Google Play Store certified in any way, and I think that's to reduce the overhead on this device to allow for better performance since it doesn't have Google services. That means you're going to have to sideload any apps you want to install. So you can go onto a browser and then find the app and download it and install it. Or you could put the APK on a micro SD card and load it up from there. But you aren't going to be able to go to the Google Play Store. You'll have to use an alternative. Now, as far as your software experience with the dual screen setup, it is pretty simple. So you have your apps here on the bottom, and then you can tap this button right here, which will bring up the apps on the top. So you can launch the app on the top or the bottom screen, depending on where you pick it. If you swipe down from the top menu, you get your standard options right here. So you can adjust the brightness, and the brightness here will adjust both screens at once. So you can't make one bright and one dim. It's just going to be a wholesale thing. Other than that, it's a pretty standard setup. You can change out your ABXY layout, but really that's about it. Now, if you go in and tap this little pencil button, it'll bring up some of the other options that you have. And there is one that says second display. So you can drag this over into the regular ones, and now that'll show up as well. So we can go back here, and then if we swipe over, now there is a second display option. And essentially all that does is when you tap on it, it turns the top screen off. And that's really about it. You can't play with only the top screen with the bottom screen off. All you can do is just turn off the top one. So it is a very bare bones setup. For example, the volume button right here will only adjust volume for the entire device. So if you're playing YouTube on one screen and a game on the other, you can't change which one to hear. You're just going to hear them both at once, which is, again, very bare bones and kind of disappointing. But beyond just the software setup, there are quite a few hiccups as well that I've discovered over the past 24 hours, and I've also seen other reviewers find too. The first thing I've seen is that the polling rate on the touch display is only 60 Hertz, which is kind of bad. That means that you're going to have a lot of missed inputs on the display. Generally, you want something that's going to be double of the refresh rate of the display itself, so everything feels responsive. For example, with the AYN Thor, even though this bottom screen is a 60 Hertz refresh rate, the touch sampling rate is actually 120 Hertz, so it feels a lot more responsive as a result. And in actual gameplay, I think it's okay if you have a casual perspective. You know, if playing a puzzle game where you're swiping left and right, sure, it's okay, but I think it could be a lot better, and it's definitely a lot better on the original hardware. So no matter what stylus that I use, either the Anbernic one or that one from Etsy, I still feel like it's a little bit less responsive than I would like. I'm getting some missed inputs, and if you're playing a game that's really touch intensive like Trauma Center, yes, every once in a while I was missing an input, but in general I think for just casual gameplay it'll be okay. So yeah, I think that's the first strike against the handheld, is that the touch sampling rate right here doesn't feel as responsive as it could be, and so I'm hoping that maybe there's a software update that Anbernic could do to make this 120 Hertz, at least on this bottom screen. These are both touch screens, but for the most part, you're going to be playing your DS games with the touch sampling on the bottom, and so I would like for the bottom screen to be 120 Hertz. Another thing I've talked about previously, when emulating Nintendo DS, there is some lag compared to the original hardware. An example I like to give is with Phantom Hourglass, where when you're moving the fairy around, you can see that the fairy is trailing behind your stylus when using it for emulation. On original hardware, the fairy is a little bit lagging behind, but nothing like how it is with emulation. And so if you're looking for something that's really responsive and a lot quicker on the dial, then that's going to be the original hardware compared to emulation writ large. So the fact that the touch input is lagging behind here isn't really necessarily a part of the touch sampling issue, but rather just the fact that emulation in general will be a little bit laggy. But one thing that I and others have noticed is that the top screen seems to be even more laggy than the bottom screen, and so it gets to the point where you can actually obviously see a difference between the top and bottom screens. A game like Sonic Rush is a great example because you can see top and bottom at the same time, and you will see the top screen trailing behind. If I slow it down to 10% right here, you can see that there's a seesaw effect where essentially the top screen is just always a few frames behind the bottom one, and that doesn't really happen on original hardware. Another thing my friend Carrie over at the Fox figured out is that if you let the device sit for about 30 seconds or so, the top screen will actually go to 40 frames per second when the bottom screen is the primary screen. So for example, right here, where I'm playing RetroArch and Super Nintendo on the bottom, the top screen is now 40 frames per second instead of 60. I think it's going into like a power save mode, and so essentially it's trying to conserve power, but that messes up the refresh rate on the top display. And so I think that's the reason why games like Sonic Rush are looking so weird is because the top screen is running at 40 frames per second compared to the bottom screen, and so everything's just lagging a little bit behind. And so to confirm this, I wanted to measure the lag myself. So I turned on New Super Mario Bros., put the same screen on both sides, and then just let it play for about 30 seconds, so that way it would have that 40 frames per second up top. And then I observed the lag from the bottom to the top screen. And even when playing it at full speed, I could definitely see that Mario up above was lagging a bit behind. If you slow it down, it's even more obvious, and if you pause it, you can see that yes, on the bottom, when Mario has already jumped, the Mario on the top hasn't even started yet. So after making this recording, I went through and counted every single frame at the 240 frames per second recording, and I found that there was an average of 14 frames of lag from the bottom screen to the top screen. And if we calculate this game running at 60 frames per second, that means that there are 3.5 frames in game from the moment that Mario jumps on the bottom to Mario jumping on the top. Now, obviously, that's not a perfect integer number, and I think it has to do with the fact that one screen's running at 40 hertz while the other one's running at 60, and so that's why I think the math is a little bit off. But either way, we are looking at about 3.5 frames of delay between the bottom and the top screens on average. To give you context, the Retroid Pocket dual screen attachment, which I made a video about a few months back, it had really bad lag between the bottom and the top screen before they fixed it with a software update. And before the software fix, there were 12 frames of lag from the bottom and the top screen, so this is actually worse than it is from Retroid before they made their software update. So what this says to me is that unless Anbernic fixes this in the software, many games are going to be unplayable, including those that are platformers like New Super Mario Bros., and rhythm games for me are also really bad. Not only is the timing really hard to get right, both from the fact that emulation is a little bit delayed, but then also the top screen is off, but then also that low touch polling rate makes it so that I have many missed inputs with a game like Rhythm Heaven. And unfortunately, the delay on the top screen is not necessarily relegated to just Nintendo DS gameplay. It'll affect basically everything you try to do on this device when it comes to multitasking. So let's use Emulation Station Desktop Edition as our initial example here. So this is a front end that I prefer. I had to side load it onto this device by putting it on my micro SD card, then loading it up. But yeah, this essentially will allow me to navigate through my different systems and then launch my games directly from here. This app just recently had an update where if you go into the other settings, there's an option to actually launch it on a second display. And so this is actually pretty cool. So you could have it browsing through Emulation Station on the bottom, and then when you're ready to launch a game, it'll show up top. So we're going to use Dragon Warrior for NES as our example, so I can launch it here. It's going to show up top. Everything's great. And the cool thing about Emulation Station is that you can view media for it as well. So I can press the Y button, and then I can scroll through and look at things like box art, or I can press up and see the actual PDF manual of the original console. So I can press the shoulder buttons here, zoom in a bit, and now I've got a map of this game, and then I can play it up top. Now, the whole 40 frames per second thing will also kick in if you've got Emulation Station running on the bottom. So right now it's running at 60 frames per second, but if I give it about 30 seconds, it'll go down to 40. And so there we go. I just waited a few seconds and now it's running at 40 frames per second up top. Now I've got the top screen selected here, so it's not even that this is the primary screen. It's just because I have two apps running at once. And again, it's kicking into that power save mode. It's an exact 40 frames per second. So it's not slowdown or anything. There's something wrong with the software. And so this is a huge bummer for me. I love the idea of being able to browse through the manual as I'm playing, but I can't do that. And in general, Emulation Station is not working fully in the Anbernic build either. If we go into Start here, go into UI Settings and Theme Downloader, I'm not able to actually bring up the theme list and download any of them. This is a permissions error that I have seen previously on other Anbernic builds, and they still haven't fixed it. I've reported it several different times, but it doesn't seem to really be doing the trick. And so unfortunately, yes, we can't download any additional themes onto this device unless we load them up manually ourselves. And so unfortunately, yeah, you're going to have to be stuck with the default theme right here, which isn't bad, but I'd love to have more choices. It's also a bummer that I can't have two apps going at once if the gaming app is on the top display. Now, if we do it the other way around, where we have the top display being Emulation Station, then launch the game here down below, this will actually work, which is nice because then we can go and look at the manual and use that just like we were talking about before, but I would love to be able to play the game up top. I think it's a more comfortable way to play the game as opposed to looking at the bottom screen. I feel like this should be the secondary screen when you're playing the game up top. That's why most Nintendo DS games have all the action up top. It's just more comfortable. And so unfortunately, if you want to do true multitasking on this device and have multiple apps going at once, you have to basically play the game on the bottom so that way you don't run into the problem where it starts running at 40 frames per second up top. And so as you can imagine, I'm pretty frustrated with the overall software experience on this device. The hardware is not half bad, but everything gets undermined by the software bugs that I found just in the first 24 hours. It feels like Anbernic doesn't put a lot of effort into their software suite, and it's really starting to show here. And based on previous track records, I don't have a lot of faith that they're going to be able to fix any of these issues or really even care about it in the first place. Now let's shift over and talk about performance, and I wasn't expecting much. I knew the RK3568 is not a very powerful chipset, but I figured it'd be good enough for Nintendo DS, and it mostly is. As expected, lightweight games like visual novels or maybe light action titles that are 2D, these play absolutely fine, and so I really wanted to test it with a bunch of games that I had heard are pretty hard to play on DS emulation. So I looked at a bunch of requests that I had been getting, as well as a couple lists online of people saying that these are the hardest games to play, and almost all of these played absolutely fine with the high resolution setting in Drastic, which is going to be a 2x resolution upscale. And yes, for the most part, these games were all playing great. Just bear in mind that many of these were a little bit laggy on that top display because of the 40 frames per second bug. But I'd say that, if you're going to be focusing on Nintendo DS emulation with this particular console, then yes, it's mostly plug and play within the Drastic app. To give you an idea, here's Pokemon Heart Gold, and I'm running this just in the regular village right here, so nothing super intensive, but if I turn on fast forward, it runs at about 300% speed. That means we got a lot of headroom here, and you can even get a bit of fast forward if you want to speed the game up too. So I think there is going to be enough power to be able to play your standard favorites, like the Pokemon series should be absolutely fine on this particular handheld. But one thing to bear in mind is that with the Drastic emulator, it is closed source, so there's not a lot of new development work that can be done for it, and the developers stopped working on it as well. There is a new fork of Drastic that someone's been working on. I'm not sure how much underlying options they have because it is closed source, but they have been adding some things to it in the menus as well as adding new filters. The filter I've been using is this sharp bilinear one. It's going to allow it to balance out the pixels without making it too fuzzy, and so that's what I've been using throughout all my testing. I think it looks fine. And by default, Anbernic has it set to the LCD 1X filter, which is going to give it a pixel grid. And I think it looks okay, but it's still not perfectly balanced. And so that's why I like the sharp bilinear one. One thing to bear in mind, if you like using retro achievements, Drastic does not support them, so unfortunately, you're not going to be able to use them here. I was able to find some performance limitations. For example, with Call of Duty 4 at a 2x resolution, I was getting some audio cracks and stutters. Not the worst thing in the world, but yes, this is one that didn't play at full speed at a 2x resolution. And then also, as expected, Golden Sun Dark Dawn was not able to play at full speed with a 2x resolution. I had tested other similar chipsets previously, and so I knew this was going to be a concern. And yes, sure enough, it runs at about 92% speed. Now, thankfully, if you just set it to the native resolution scale, it's going to look a little bit chunkier, but it will play at full speed. So I do think this game is going to be fully playable, just not at that upscale. The only other game that I found that I had to play at a 1x resolution scale to be playable was this Wizard of Oz game, which is notorious for being really hard to emulate. The issue with this one is that it still played at full speed at a 2x resolution scale, but was very flickery, and so setting it down to the native resolution fixed that. So this is a game that I would also play at native resolution, but it still plays fine. Now personally, I prefer the Melon DS app. This one is more updated, has more features to it, and it also has retro achievements, but unfortunately it is nowhere close to playing at full speed on the RGDS. Even playing a lightweight game like New Super Mario Bros. Only runs at about 50, maybe 60% speed altogether, so this is far from being playable for me. And if a lightweight game like this is not playing at full speed, that means that almost the entire catalog is also not going to play. Now, in their promotion materials, Anbernic said that this could play 3DS games. They even showed some off in a video, but it was really stuttery, so I didn't have high expectations. But against my own better judgment, I did try it out, and it was a disaster. So I started with Citra MMJ. This is the more performance-minded emulator, and yes, this one is just not working at all. I couldn't get the dual screen settings to work on their software at all. It didn't matter what settings I adjusted. And on top of that, even lightweight games running in the menus were only at about 60% speed, so I don't think that many games, if any, are going to be very playable. Now, the Azahar emulator does work in dual screen mode. That's the one they preloaded on this device, but unfortunately, it's nowhere close to playing at a good speed either. If we take New Super Mario Bros. 2, which I consider to be a fairly lightweight game, this one is also only running at about 50 to 60% speed. So yes, there might be a couple 3DS games you could play, but absolutely do not buy this device to play this catalog. Now, beyond just dual screen gameplay, you can obviously just play with a single screen too, so let's talk about some of that experience. For the really lightweight stuff like Game Boy and Game Boy Advance, including like your 8-bit and 16-bit console systems, these are going to play absolutely fine. So in terms of performance, this should be okay. And for these games, I played with a Pixel AA shader to balance out the pixels, much like I did with Nintendo DS, because this is a 480p display, which means it's not going to scale correctly, but when you use a shader like that, it works out fine. Moving on to the harder to play systems, PS1 was okay. I was able to play heavyweight games like Tekken 3, no problem via RetroArch. Nintendo 64 was mostly okay. I was able to play lightweight games like Mario 64 and even F-Zero X, which I would consider to be like a medium weight game. This one played at full speed as well. However, once you get up to like Cruisin' USA, then this one is just dragging. I would say this is playing at about 2/3 speed, so definitely nowhere close to being at full speed. So there are going to be games that are limited here, and this is with the standalone Nintendo 64 emulator, which should give you the best performance. I was also surprised to see just how poorly Dreamcast played. For example, with Sonic Adventure 2, one of the harder games to play on the system, it was only running at less than half speed using RetroArch with the Flycast core. Moving over to the standalone version of Flycast with frame skip turned all the way up, I was getting about 45 frames per second. So again, nowhere close to full speed. Usually I consider Redream to be the most performance-minded emulator on lower powered hardware, but unfortunately this one was also only averaging about 45 frames per second. And again, this is with frame skip turned on. So I find this game to be unplayable. What's crazy to me is that even lighter weight games like Soul Calibur 2 only played at about 50 frames per second, so this one was lagging a bunch as well. It looks like Dreamcast just really isn't a very good system on this handheld. It's a pretty similar experience with PSP. I was able to play some lightweight games okay, but middleweight games like Ridge Racer had a lot of lag and stutters to it. There were certain parts of the track where it would dip down to about 52 frames per second, which to me is unplayable at this speed. And of course, if you get into the heavyweight stuff like God of War Chains of Olympus, yeah, don't even think about it. This only plays at about half speed at a 1x resolution, so you'd have to use hacks like frame skip and other things just to get this semi-playable, and I don't think that's worth it. And then finally, the last retro system that I tested before I just basically gave up on the performance part is Sega Saturn, and this one is also playing at only about 50%, maybe even 40% speed with the Yabasan core. You might get a little bit better performance with the standalone Yabasan app, but I would say it's still not going to be playable with most games, and Nights into Dreams is not a very heavyweight game in the first place. Okay, even though this is kind of a first impressions video, I've got a lot to say about it, so let's talk about what I like and what I don't like about my experience over the first 24 hours. Number one, I like that it's a nostalgic design. It kind of looks like a Nintendo DSi XL, and I know a lot of people have been excited about this handheld just because the promo materials make it look so cool. And I also love that Anbernic is trying to make a dual screen setup. I love the idea of being able to multitask or play DS games, especially on a device that looks like a DS. I also appreciate that it's a slim and trim handheld. It's easy to pocket, and I think that as long as you're used to a DSi XL size, this is going to be a perfect fit. Now, you knew this was coming, but there are a lot of things I don't like about this thing as well. Number one being the fact that it is very underpowered. It's mostly good enough to be able to play DS games, and most of them at a 2x resolution upscale, but if you're trying to make this like an all-around emulation device, it's actually really disappointing. I thought at the very least it'd be able to play Dreamcast pretty well, but no, I found that to be one of the worst systems out there. And there are a ton of catastrophic bugs in this software, to the point where it took away from my gaming experience in just about every single platform. For DS games, there was a bad lag between the top and the bottom screen, and then when trying to do multitasking, I was severely limited because I couldn't put my games on the top display if I was doing anything else on the bottom. There was a time when Anbernic had some really bad software a few years back, and the custom development community basically would swoop in and fix everything, and it was really awesome. They were doing that as a hobby, but I think we're well past that at this point. The fact that this software is in this bad of a shape on Android less than a month before it launches from a company who has a history of not really updating their software very often is a really bad sign for me. It's also really apparent that in order to get it under that $100 price point, they cut a lot of corners. The resolution of the screens is only 480p, which is not a good scale for Nintendo DS, which just doesn't make a lot of sense given the fact that this thing looks like a Nintendo DS. A big contrast to that would be the Anbernic RG 34XX, which is a Game Boy Advance style handheld. You can see it just looks like a GBA, and And it's got a screen that is a 3x integer scale of the GBA, so it looks beautiful when playing those specific games. So this is kind of like a dream come true. If you want a modern GBA, you have one right here. And Anbernic could have definitely improved this. If they had used a 720p resolution display, which they've used with other 4-inch devices, that would have been a 3.8x scale of Nintendo DS. It's not quite an integer scale, but it is close. And if they wanted to go the full Monty, they could use a 960p resolution display instead, which would give them a perfect 5x resolution upscale. I think they also cut corners on things like the analog sticks, which do not feel good, and then also those clicky shoulder buttons. They didn't spend the time or the money to dampen them as well. You can also see it in little things too, like the fact that the speakers buzz, or that we only have 32 gigs of internal storage, which really limits the amount of Android games you can play on this device. And then finally, the other thing that kind of bothers me about this device is the charging experience. I found that on average, I've been getting about 4 hours of battery life before I have to charge it, and it takes about 3 hours to fully charge it. So it is not a very convenient charging experience. So putting this all together, even though this is an impressions video and kind of more like a preliminary review, I can say with confidence that no, I do not recommend the RG DS at its current state. The hardware itself is not half bad, but the software is a disaster. This is probably one of the most frustrating devices that I've tested before. So the way I see it, unless the software bugs get fixed, I'm not going to make a review of this device because I don't want to waste my time and I don't want to waste your time. And so I'm hoping that they will get this stuff fixed and they'll get it fixed before it ships and I can make another actual review of this device. But as it stands right now, I just don't see a lot of value in it. The beauty of a device like the Anbernic RG 34XX is that it's an improvement over the GBA in just about every single way. It's got a backlit display with a 3x resolution upscale, it's got USB-C charging, it's got additional buttons, and the power to be able to play other systems. And to top it off, it's a much cheaper experience. It's about $60 for the new handheld compared to getting a GBA and then upgrading all the components. That's going to cost you about $250. And so this is just a great value and a deal overall. And I'm not seeing the same value with the RG DS compared to the DSi XL. This is about $100 for a used DSi XL, and it's going to give you a much better experience. Less input lag, the games are just going to run naturally, and it's going to have the same body shape, which feels a lot better in the hand too. So personally, I don't think it's worth spending the same amount of money to get the RG DS, which is a downgrade in many different ways. Outside of being a Nintendo DS, I was also hoping that the RG DS would be a clamshell replacement for me, something that's maybe a little bit better than the RG 35XX SP. Like I mentioned, the SP is a bit more of a cramped experience, and so I like the idea of maybe having the RG DS as a dual screen clamshell option, not just for DS games, but for like other stuff, you know, playing Game Boy or Nintendo or Super Nintendo games on something like this would be very comfortable. But unfortunately, even that experience is severely compromised due to Anbernic's software bugs. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'm hoping a software update will move the needle, but I'm not holding out a lot of hope. I'm kind of disappointed. I thought this was going to be an excellent budget handheld that would be under $100 that would be able to play Nintendo DS, but unfortunately, I'm just not seeing it. I think there are too many deal breakers. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.